when Supreme Court Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson agreed to what seemed like a routine legal symposium. She never imagined it would become the moment that shattered her untouchable reputation forever. Across from her sat Pam Bondi, quietly prepared, with something that would turn the entire legal establishment upside down. What happened in the next 30 seconds didn't just end a career, it exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of American justice. Some moments in history arrive without warning, reshaping everything we thought we knew about power, privilege, and accountability. This is the story of one such moment, where silence became the most devastating weapon, and truth cut through decades of carefully constructed lies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mahogany-paneled auditorium at Georgetown University Law Center had witnessed countless debates over its storied history, but nothing quite like what was about to unfold on this crisp October evening. The invitation-only event, titled Constitutional Interpretation in Modern America, was supposed to be a civilized exchange between two prominent legal minds. Instead, it would become the stage for one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune. In recent judicial history, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson arrived fashionably late, her entourage of clerks and security personnel creating a small commotion as they swept through the building's marble corridors. She wore her confidence like expensive jewelry, each gesture calculated to remind everyone present of her elevated status. The first African-American woman to serve on the Supreme Court had grown accustomed to deference, to the careful way people chose their words around her, to the unspoken understanding that challenging her positions required extraordinary tact. Tonight, she expected no different. Her opponent in this intellectual sparring match was Pam Bondi, the former Florida Attorney General, who had largely retreated from public life after her tenure ended. To Jackson, this was little more than an opportunity to demonstrate her superior legal acumen against someone she privately considered a political relic, a footnote in legal history, who had somehow managed to secure a seat at this prestigious table. The audience was filled with law professors, federal judges, prominent attorneys, and students lucky enough to secure tickets to what was being billed as a once-in-a-lifetime discussion. Television cameras from C-SPAN lined the back of the room, their red recording lights already glowing as they prepared to capture what everyone assumed would be a showcase of Jackson's intellectual dominance. Jackson took her place at the elevated panel table with theatrical precision, adjusting her designer glasses and smoothing her judicial robes, which she had chosen to wear despite this being an academic rather than judicial setting. The symbolism was intentional and unmistakable. She represented the highest court in the land, while her counterpart was merely a former state official. The power dynamic in her mind was already established. Pam Bondi entered the auditorium with far less fanfare. She carried herself with quiet dignity, wearing a simple navy suit that spoke of professionalism without ostentation. Her hair was pulled back in an understated style, and she carried only a single slim briefcase. To many observers, she appeared almost unremarkable next to Jackson's commanding presence. This perception was exactly what she intended. As Bondi took her seat, Jackson offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes, the kind of expression seasoned. Politicians perfect for cameras while harboring entirely different thoughts. The moderator, Professor Michael Henley from Georgetown's Constitutional Law Department, had been carefully selected for his reputation as someone who would ensure the discussion remained within acceptable bounds of academic decorum. The format was straightforward enough. Each participant would have 15 minutes to present their perspective on current constitutional challenges, followed by a moderated discussion and audience questions. What neither the moderator nor the audience knew was that this would be unlike any legal symposium they had ever attended. Jackson began with a presentation that was part legal lecture, part intellectual performance art. She spoke eloquently about the evolution of constitutional interpretation, weaving in references to landmark cases and legal theories with the fluidity of someone who had spent years honing her craft before the nation's highest tribunal. Her voice carried the authority of absolute certainty, the tone of someone accustomed to having the final word in any legal discussion. Throughout her presentation, she made subtle but unmistakable references to what she called outdated approaches to constitutional law and the narrow thinking that has held back legal progress. While she never mentioned Bondi by name, her meaning was clear to everyone in the room. She was establishing intellectual superiority before the real discussion even began. The audience responded with the kind of appreciative murmur that academia reserves for its most polished performers. Law students scribbled notes furiously, professors nodded approvingly, and the cameras captured every moment of what appeared to be a masterful display of legal scholarship. When Jackson concluded her opening remarks, she leaned back in her chair. With visible satisfaction, her posture radiating confidence. She had done exactly what she came to do, establish herself as the dominant intellectual force in the room. Now all that remained was to demonstrate this superiority during the discussion phase, where she fully expected to dismantle whatever arguments her opponent might present. Pam Bondi's turn to speak arrived with far less anticipation from the audience. Many had already decided that the real intellectual content of the evening had concluded with Jackson's presentation. Bondi was seen as little more than a warm-up act who had somehow found herself sharing the stage with legal royalty. Bondi rose slowly, moved to the podium, and placed her hands gently on either side of the lectern. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. For a moment, she simply stood there, her eyes moving across the audience with calm assessment. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than Jackson's had been, but it carried a different kind of authority. It was the voice of someone who had spent years in courtrooms where theatrics mattered less than facts, where preparation trumped performance every time. She began with what seemed like a conventional legal analysis, discussing constitutional principles and judicial precedent, with competent but unremarkable precision. Her delivery was measured, professional, but not particularly memorable. Several audience members checked their phones, and even some of the cameras seemed to lose focus, their operators perhaps anticipating that the evening's highlight had already passed. But those who were paying close attention noticed something peculiar about Bondi's presentation. While her words followed traditional academic patterns, her eyes occasionally moved to Jackson with the kind of measured assessment that suggested she was studying her opponent rather than simply delivering prepared remarks. There was something calculating in her gaze, a quality that hinted at deeper preparation than her modest demeanor suggested. As Bondi spoke about the importance of judicial integrity and constitutional fidelity, Jackson began to show signs of impatience. She shifted in her chair, glanced at her watch, and at one point turned to whisper something to one of her clerks that elicited a barely suppressed chuckle. Her body language conveyed clear disdain for what she perceived as pedestrian legal analysis, delivered by someone clearly out of her intellectual league. The moderator, sensing the tension building in the room, prepared to transition to the discussion phase of the program. This was where Jackson expected to truly shine, where her quick wit and superior knowledge would allow her to systematically dismantle any arguments Bondi might present. She had participated in hundreds of such discussions throughout her career, and she had never encountered an opponent who could match her combination of legal expertise and rhetorical skill. What Jackson couldn't have anticipated was that she was walking directly into a trap that had been months in the making. While she had spent weeks preparing intellectual arguments and crafting clever responses to anticipated questions, Bondi had been conducting an entirely different kind of preparation. She had been investigating. The evidence Bondi carried in her simple briefcase represented the culmination of a painstaking investigation that had taken her deep into financial records, communication logs, and legal documents that told a story far different from the one Jackson presented to the public. It was evidence that revealed a pattern of ethical violations, conflicts of interest, and judicial misconduct that would have shocked even the most cynical observers of the American legal system. But Bondi's strategy wasn't to lead with this evidence. Instead, she planned to allow Jackson's arrogance to guide her toward a moment of vulnerability, a point where her own words would create the perfect opening for devastating revelation. It was a technique she had perfected during her years as a prosecutor, where timing often mattered more than the strength of the evidence itself. As the formal presentations concluded and the discussion phase began, Jackson leaned forward with anticipatory pleasure. She had spent her entire career in environments where intellectual combat was prized above all else, where the ability to verbally overwhelm an opponent was considered the highest form of professional achievement. Tonight, she was confident. Would be no different. The moderator posed the first question, asking both participants to discuss their views on judicial restraint versus judicial activism. Jackson responded first, delivering a carefully crafted answer that managed to sound both intellectually sophisticated and politically safe. Her response drew appreciative nods from the academic audience and seemed to further establish her dominance. In the discussion, when the question was directed to Bondi, Jackson prepared herself for what she expected would be a conventional, perhaps even simplistic response that would provide her with easy targets for intellectual dismantling. Instead, Bondi's answer was measured, thoughtful, and strategically designed to draw Jackson into overconfident territory. Bondi spoke about the importance of judicial humility, about the need for judges to remember that they serve the law rather than shaping it according to personal preference. Her words were carefully chosen to appeal to traditional legal values while simultaneously creating subtle pressure points that would encourage Jackson to respond more aggressively than wisdom might dictate. The trap was being set with surgical precision, and Jackson walked directly into it. As the discussion continued, Jackson became increasingly animated, her responses growing more pointed and personal. She began making barely veiled references to what she called provincial legal thinking and the limitations of those who have never operated at the highest levels of jurisprudence. Her arrogance was becoming more apparent with each exchange, her tone growing more condescending as she attempted to establish intellectual dominance through superior bearing alone. The audience began to sense a shift in the room's dynamics. What had started as a polite academic discussion was evolving into something more personal, more confrontational. Jackson's supporters watched with growing unease as their champion's demeanor became increasingly imperious, while those sympathetic to Bondi found themselves impressed by her composure under what was becoming clear provocation. It was during this escalating tension that Jackson made her fatal error. Responding to what she perceived as an insufficiently deferential comment from Bondi about judicial ethics, Jackson allowed her mask of professional courtesy to slip completely. Her voice took on the tone of someone accustomed to absolute authority, addressing a clear inferior. "Perhaps," Jackson said, her words dripping with condescension, "those who have spent their careers in state-level politics might not fully appreciate the complexities of constitutional interpretation at the federal level. There's a significant difference between prosecuting local criminals and grappling with the fundamental questions that shape our democratic society." The insult was delivered with such casual cruelty that several audience members audibly gasped. It wasn't just an attack on Bondi's qualifications. It was a dismissal of her entire professional life as somehow beneath serious consideration. Jackson had crossed the line from intellectual disagreement into personal humiliation, and she had done so in front of cameras that were broadcasting her words to a national audience. But if Jackson expected this verbal assault to crush her opponent's spirit or provoke an emotional response that would further demonstrate Bondi's supposed inadequacy, she had severely miscalculated. Instead of reacting with anger or defensive justification, Bondi simply paused, allowing Jackson's words to hang in the air like a challenge that demanded response. The silence stretched for several seconds, during which the entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath. The cameras focused on Bondi's face, which remained completely composed, showing neither hurt nor anger. Instead, there was something else. In her expression, something that suggested Jackson's attack had crossed a line that would have consequences far beyond anything the Supreme Court justice could have anticipated. When Bondi finally spoke, her voice was quieter than before, but it carried a new quality that commanded absolute attention from everyone in the room. There was no anger in her tone, no defensive posturing, just the calm certainty of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. "Justice Jackson," Bondi said, her words measured and precise, "since you've chosen to question my qualifications and suggest that my experience prosecuting local criminals somehow makes me unfit to discuss constitutional law, perhaps this would be an appropriate time to examine what true judicial integrity actually looks like." As she spoke, Bondi reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thin manila folder. The action was deliberate, unhurried, but it sent a ripple of anticipation through the audience. Even Jackson, despite her attempts to maintain an expression of dismissive superiority, couldn't entirely hide her curiosity about what the folder might contain. Bondi placed the folder on the table in front of her, her hand resting gently on its cover. The gesture was subtle, but it transformed the entire dynamic of the discussion. Suddenly, Jackson was no longer the only person in the room holding cards, and the confidence that had carried her through the evening began to show its first hairline cracks. "You see," Bondi continued, her voice maintaining its even tone, "during my years prosecuting those local criminals you mentioned, I learned something important about evidence. I learned that the truth has a way of revealing itself, especially when people become overconfident about their ability to hide it." The room had fallen completely silent. Even the constant background noise of note-taking and whispered conversations had ceased as every person present focused entirely on the unfolding drama. The cameras, sensing that something significant was developing, tightened their focus on the two women at the center of what was rapidly becoming much more than an academic discussion. Jackson's expression began to change. The supreme confidence that had characterized her demeanor throughout the evening was being replaced by something else, something that looked suspiciously like concern. For the first time since arriving at the symposium, she appeared uncertain about what would happen next. Bondi opened the folder with deliberate care, revealing what appeared to be several documents arranged in precise order. She didn't immediately examine their contents, instead keeping her eyes fixed on Jackson as she spoke. "The interesting thing about serving on the Supreme Court," Bondi observed, "is that it comes with certain ethical obligations. Obligations about financial disclosure, about recusal when conflicts of interest arise, about maintaining the appearance of impartiality that is so crucial to public confidence in our judicial system." Jackson shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The supremely confident woman, who had begun the evening expecting to intellectually dominate her opponent, was now clearly struggling to maintain her composure. Something in Bondi's tone, in the careful way she was handling the documents, suggested that this was no longer a theoretical discussion about constitutional law. "Of course," Bondi continued, "most people assume that Supreme Court justices are above the kind of ethical lapses that sometimes affect lower-level officials. After all, these are individuals who have reached the pinnacle of the American legal system. Surely they understand the importance of maintaining the highest standards of judicial conduct." The emphasis Bondi placed on the word "surely" carried unmistakable irony, and Jackson was no longer able to hide her growing alarm. Her hands, which had been resting confidently on the table throughout the evening, were now clenched into fists, and a slight tremor had appeared in her voice when she attempted to interject. "I'm not sure what you're implying," Jackson said. But her words lacked the authority that had characterized her earlier statements. For the first time all evening, she sounded defensive rather than commanding. Bondi smiled slightly, but there was no warmth in the expression. It was the smile of a prosecutor who had just received confirmation that her target was exactly where she wanted them to be. "I'm not implying anything, Justice Jackson. I'm simply observing that public trust in our judicial system depends on the belief that those who interpret our laws are themselves above reproach, that they don't use their positions for personal gain, that they recuse themselves when appropriate, that they follow the same ethical standards they expect from everyone else." As she spoke, Bondi lifted the first document from her folder. Even from across the table, Jackson could see that it was an official form of some kind, with the distinctive letterhead of a government agency. The Supreme Court Justice's face went pale as she recognized what she was looking at. "This," Bondi said, holding up the document for the cameras to capture, "is a financial disclosure form filed by Justice Jackson for the previous fiscal year. It's a public document, available to anyone who knows where to look and has the patience to examine it carefully." Jackson tried to interrupt, but Bondi continued speaking in the same measured tone that had characterized her presentation throughout the evening. "What's interesting about this particular disclosure," Bondi observed, "is not what it reveals, but what it conceals. You see, there are certain investments listed here that might surprise people who assume Supreme Court justices are careful to avoid conflicts of interest." The auditorium was now completely silent, except for the sound of cameras clicking and the barely audible hum of recording equipment. Every person present understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, something that would likely be studied and discussed for years to come. Jackson made one final attempt to regain control of the situation. Drawing on years of courtroom experience, she tried to project an air of judicial authority that might intimidate her opponent into backing down. "Ms. Bondi," she said, her voice carrying what she hoped was commanding disapproval, "if you have some kind of accusation to make, I suggest you be very careful about the implications of your words. Making unfounded allegations against a sitting Supreme Court justice is a serious matter that could have significant legal consequences." But instead of being intimidated, Bondi seemed almost relieved that Jackson had chosen to respond with threats rather than explanations. It was exactly the kind of response that would make what came next even more devastating. "Oh, I'm being very careful about my words, Justice Jackson, and I'm particularly careful about ensuring that everything I'm about to say is fully supported by documentary evidence." Bondi lifted a second document from her folder, this one bearing the official seal of the Securities and Exchange Commission. "This is a record of stock transactions conducted by a portfolio management firm called Meridian Capital Associates. According to their filings, one of their major clients is a family trust established by Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson and her husband." Jackson's attempt to maintain judicial composure was crumbling visibly. Her breathing had become shallow, and she was gripping the edge of the table with white knuckles. The interesting thing about these transactions, Bondi continued, is their timing. It seems that the Jackson Family Trust made several significant investments in pharmaceutical companies just weeks before the Supreme Court agreed to hear cases that would directly impact those same companies' stock values. A collective gasp rose from the audience. Several law professors leaned forward in their seats, their faces showing the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something that violates fundamental assumptions about institutional integrity. Now, of course, Bondi said, her voice maintaining its deadly calm. There could be innocent explanations for this timing. Perhaps it was simply coincidence that these investments were made so close to decisions that would benefit them. Perhaps Justice Jackson was unaware of the connection between her financial interests and the cases coming before her court. Jackson tried once more to assert control, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "This is outrageous," she managed to say. "You're making serious allegations without any proof of wrongdoing. Financial disclosure forms are complex documents that require careful interpretation by qualified professionals." Bondi nodded sympathetically, as if she completely understood Jackson's position. "You're absolutely right that these matters require careful interpretation by qualified professionals. That's why I asked several experts in judicial ethics to review these documents before bringing them to public attention." She lifted a third document from her folder. "This is a preliminary analysis prepared by the Committee for Judicial Accountability, a non-partisan organization that monitors federal judicial conduct. Their conclusion, based on the evidence I've presented, is that Justice Jackson's failure to recuse herself from cases affecting her financial interests represents a clear violation of federal judicial ethics standards." The room erupted. Law. Students whispered urgently to each other. Professors pulled out their phones to verify what they were hearing, and the television cameras swung between Bondi and Jackson, capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming one of the most significant judicial scandals in recent memory. Jackson, her face now flushed with a combination of anger and panic, made one final desperate attempt to turn the situation around. "This is clearly a politically motivated attack," she declared, her voice rising above the growing murmur of the audience. "Ms. Bondi is using this forum to make wild accusations that have no basis in reality. I demand that this discussion be terminated immediately." But her words only seemed to confirm what many in the audience were already thinking. Instead of addressing the substance of the allegations, Jackson was deflecting, attacking the messenger, rather than engaging with the message. It was exactly the kind of response that guilty parties typically offered when confronted with evidence of their misconduct. Bondi waited for the noise to subside before responding, and when she spoke, her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent years presenting evidence in high-stakes situations. "Justice Jackson, these aren't wild accusations. They're documented facts, supported by official government records and analyzed by experts in judicial conduct. The evidence speaks for itself." She gestured toward the documents spread before her. "The real question isn't whether these ethical violations occurred. The evidence makes that clear. The real question is what the American people should expect from those who hold the highest judicial office in our nation." The words hung in the air like a verdict, and in that moment, everyone present understood that something fundamental had shifted. The woman who had entered the auditorium as an untouchable figure of judicial authority was now exposed as someone who had used her position for personal gain, someone who had violated the most basic principles of judicial ethics. Jackson's career, her reputation, and her legacy had been destroyed not through political maneuvering or partisan attack, but through the methodical presentation of facts that she could neither deny nor explain away. In less than 30 seconds, Pam Bondi had accomplished what years of congressional oversight and media scrutiny had failed to achieve. As the implications of what had just transpired began to sink in, the auditorium filled with the kind of electric tension that accompanies truly historic moments. Everyone present understood that they had just witnessed something unprecedented, something that would reshape discussions about judicial accountability for years to come. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the woman who had arrived that evening, expecting to demonstrate her intellectual superiority over a former state official, was now sitting in stunned silence as the foundations of her career crumbled around her. The arrogance that had defined her approach to the evening had led her directly into a trap that she never saw coming. A trap that had been set with the kind of prosecutorial precision that comes from years of experience in situations where preparation matters more than position. The next few minutes would determine not just the immediate consequences of these revelations, but the broader impact on public trust in the American judicial system. And as Pam Bondi calmly organized her documents for what was clearly going to be an even more detailed presentation of evidence, it became clear that the evening's surprises were far from over. The silence that followed Jackson's desperate deflection stretched across the auditorium like a heavy fog, thick with anticipation and disbelief. Professor Henley, the moderator who had expected to guide a routine academic discussion, found himself frozen at his podium, unsure whether to intervene or allow this unprecedented confrontation to continue. His decades of experience moderating legal forums had never prepared him for anything remotely resembling what was unfolding before his eyes. In the front row, Dean Patricia Morrison of Georgetown Law School leaned forward in her seat, her face a mask of professional concern. She understood the gravity of what was happening better than most. If Bondi's allegations were substantiated, this wouldn't just be a career-ending scandal for Jackson. It would represent a crisis of confidence in the Supreme Court itself, an institution already struggling with questions about its legitimacy and impartiality. Jackson's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the glass of water beside her microphone. The simple act of drinking seemed to require enormous concentration, as if her motor functions were struggling to operate under the weight of her mounting panic. When she set the glass down, it clinked against the wooden table with enough force to be picked up by the sensitive microphones, the sound echoing through the auditorium's speakers like a gavel striking wood. Bondi waited patiently for Jackson to compose herself, understanding that rushing this moment would only diminish its impact. She had learned long ago that in situations like this, silence was often more powerful than words. Every second that passed without Jackson offering a substantive response to the allegations only served to strengthen the impression that she had no adequate defense. From her position at the table, Bondi could see the audience beginning to process what they had just witnessed. The initial shock was giving way to a growing sense of outrage, particularly among the law students who had entered the auditorium that evening, expecting to hear from one of their judicial heroes. Their faces showed the kind of disappointment that comes from discovering that someone you admired has betrayed everything you thought they represented. Dr. Sarah Chen, a constitutional law professor from Harvard who had traveled to Georgetown specifically to hear Jackson speak, pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly. Within moments, she was sending messages to colleagues across the country, alerting them to what was happening in real time. The academic legal community was small and tightly connected, and news of this magnitude would spread through professional networks long before it reached mainstream media outlets. Meanwhile, the C-SPAN cameras continued rolling, their operators understanding instinctively that they were capturing something historically significant. The network's producer, watching from the control room, had already contacted headquarters to alert them that the evening's programming was taking an unexpected turn that would likely dominate legal news cycles for weeks to come. Jackson finally managed to speak, her voice hoarse and uncertain. "Ms. Bondi, even if your interpretation of these documents were correct, which I strongly dispute, you're discussing complex financial arrangements that involve multiple parties and intricate legal structures. You're simplifying situations that require nuanced understanding." B, it was a weak response, the kind of legalistic obfuscation that might work in academic settings where precision of language could obscure inconvenient truths. But Bondi had spent too many years in courtrooms to be impressed by such tactics. She recognized desperation when she heard it, and Jackson's response confirmed that the Supreme Court justice had no substantive defense to offer. Bondi nodded thoughtfully, as if she were genuinely considering Jackson's point. "You're absolutely right that these financial arrangements are complex. That's why I didn't rely solely on my own interpretation of the documents." She reached into her briefcase and withdrew a thick manila envelope that she had not yet opened. The envelope bore the official seal of the Office of Government Ethics, and Jackson's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of that particular marking. "3 weeks ago," Bondi explained, "I submitted a formal complaint to the Office of Government Ethics regarding potential conflicts of interest involving sitting federal judges. The complaint included all of the documentation I've presented here tonight, along with additional evidence that I haven't yet discussed." Jackson's face went ashen. The Office of Government Ethics was the federal agency responsible for investigating potential violations of ethical standards by government officials, including federal judges. A formal investigation by that office could result in sanctions ranging from public censure to impeachment proceedings, depending on the severity of the violations uncovered. "Yesterday," Bondi continued, "I received their preliminary response to my complaint." She opened the envelope and withdrew a letter bearing the official letterhead of the Office of Government Ethics. The document was several pages long, and even from across the table, Jackson could see that it contained detailed analysis and conclusions. "According to the Office of Government Ethics," Bondi read, "the evidence submitted in support of this complaint raises serious and credible concerns about potential violations of federal judicial ethics standards that warrant immediate investigation. They have formally opened a comprehensive review of Justice Jackson's financial disclosures and recusal decisions dating back to her confirmation to the Supreme Court." The auditorium erupted in a cacophony of whispered conversations and urgent phone calls. Several audience members rose from their seats, either to get better views of the documents Bondi was displaying or to step into the hallway where they could make phone calls without disrupting the proceedings. The carefully controlled atmosphere of academic discourse had completely evaporated, replaced by the electric energy of breaking news. Professor Henley finally found his voice. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess to allow everyone to process what we've heard," he suggested, clearly hoping to diffuse the escalating tension. But Bondi shook her head politely. "I appreciate the suggestion, Professor Henley, but I think it's important to present all of the relevant information while we have this opportunity. The American people deserve to understand the full scope of what we're discussing." Jackson tried once more to assert control over the situation. "This is completely inappropriate," she declared, her voice rising. "Using an academic forum to launch personal attacks based on selective interpretation of public documents represents a new low in political discourse." But her words rang hollow. By framing Bondi's evidence-based presentation as a personal attack, Jackson was inadvertently confirming that she had no substantive response to the allegations. Moreover, her increasingly desperate tone was undermining the judicial authority she was trying to project. Bondi remained unruffled by Jackson's outburst. "Justice Jackson, these aren't personal attacks. These are documented facts about your conduct as a federal judge. And unfortunately, the evidence I've presented so far represents only a small portion of what the investigation has uncovered." She withdrew another document from her briefcase, this one bearing the letterhead of a major financial institution. This is a bank record showing wire transfers totaling $3 million that were made to accounts controlled by the Jackson Family Trust over the past 18 months. The transfers originated from investment accounts managed by Blackstone Financial, a firm that specializes in managing portfolios for high-net-worth clients seeking to maximize returns from regulatory arbitrage. Jackson's mouth opened and closed, wordlessly. The level of detail Bondi was presenting made it clear that this wasn't a fishing expedition or political theater. This was the result of a thorough investigation that had uncovered specific evidence of financial misconduct. Regulatory arbitrage, Bondi explained for the benefit of those in the audience who might not be familiar with the term, is an investment strategy that seeks to profit from differences in regulatory treatment of similar financial instruments. In Justice Jackson's case, it appears that her family trust was investing in companies that would benefit from specific Supreme Court decisions, with the investments timed to maximize profits from those decisions. The implications were staggering. If Bondi's allegations were accurate, Jackson hadn't simply failed to recuse herself from cases where she had financial interests. She had actively participated in an investment strategy designed to profit from her advanced knowledge of how the Supreme Court would rule on major cases. Dr. Marcus Williams, a professor of judicial ethics at Yale Law School, who was attending the symposium, stood up abruptly and walked toward the exit. As one of the nation's leading experts on federal judicial conduct, he understood better than most what these revelations meant for the Supreme Court's credibility. His departure sent ripples through the academic audience, many of whom recognized him and understood that his reaction represented a professional judgment about the seriousness of what they were witnessing. Jackson made one final attempt to salvage the situation. These are complex financial matters that are being taken out of context and misrepresented for political purposes. I have always conducted myself in accordance with the highest ethical standards, and my record of judicial service speaks for itself. But even as she spoke, Jackson's voice lacked conviction. The mountain of evidence Bondi had presented was too detailed and too well documented to be dismissed as political manipulation. Moreover, Jackson's failure to offer specific rebuttals to any of the allegations was becoming increasingly conspicuous. Bondi opened her briefcase one final time and withdrew what appeared to be a recording device. The sight of the small digital recorder sent another wave of tension through the audience, as everyone present understood that whatever Bondi was about to reveal would likely be even more damaging than what had come before. 3 months ago, Bondi announced, "I was contacted by a former clerk to Justice Jackson who expressed concerns about what they had observed during their time at the Supreme Court. This individual provided me with information about internal discussions regarding case scheduling and strategic considerations that appeared to be influenced by factors other than legal merit." Jackson's composure finally cracked completely. "You cannot seriously be suggesting that you're going to play secret recordings in this forum," she said, her voice approaching hysteria. "This is beyond any acceptable standard of professional conduct." Bondi looked at Jackson with something approaching pity. "Justice Jackson, I'm not going to play any recordings without the consent of all parties involved. But I am going to tell you what those recordings revealed, because the information is directly relevant to the ethical violations we've been discussing." She pressed a button on the recording device, but instead of audio, she displayed a written a transcript on her tablet, and held it up for the cameras to capture. According to the former clerk who contacted me, there were multiple instances where Justice Jackson discussed pending cases in terms of their potential impact on her family's financial interests. On one occasion, she allegedly stated, and I, quote, "We need to make sure the pharmaceutical ruling comes down before the end of the quarter, so the portfolio adjustments can be made in time." The auditorium fell completely silent. If accurate, this quotation represented direct evidence that Jackson was coordinating Supreme Court decisions with her personal investment strategy, a violation so egregious that it would likely result in immediate impeachment proceedings. Jackson rose unsteadily from her chair, her face flushed with a combination of anger and panic. "This is completely fabricated," she said, but her voice cracked as she spoke. "No such conversations ever took place, and I demand that you produce the actual recordings to substantiate these outrageous claims." Bondi nodded calmly. "The recordings, along with all supporting documentation, have been submitted to the Office of Government Ethics as part of their investigation. They will also be made available to the House Judiciary Committee, which has jurisdiction over federal judicial conduct." The mention of the House Judiciary Committee sent another shockwave through the audience. Everyone present understood that congressional involvement would transform this from an academic discussion into a full-scale political crisis that would dominate national headlines for months. Professor Henley made one final attempt to restore order to the proceedings. "I think we need to suspend this discussion immediately," he announced. "What we're hearing involves serious allegations that require careful investigation by appropriate authorities." But Bondi held up her hand. "Professor Henley, I appreciate your concern, but I have one final piece of information that I believe the public needs to hear tonight." She withdrew a final document from her briefcase, this one bearing the seal of the Supreme Court itself. "This is an internal Supreme Court memorandum dated 6 weeks ago, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request filed by the Committee for Judicial Accountability. The memorandum discusses concerns raised by several justices about potential conflicts of interest affecting certain members of the court." Jackson sank back into her chair, her face pale and her hands shaking visibly. The existence of internal Supreme Court discussions about her conduct meant that her colleagues were already aware of potential problems, and their concerns had been documented in official court records. According to this memorandum, Bondi continued, Chief Justice Roberts specifically recommended that Justice Jackson consult with the court's ethics advisor about potential recusal obligations related to her financial interests. The memorandum notes that this recommendation was made in response to growing concerns among court personnel about the appearance of conflicts of interest. The implications were devastating. Not only had Jackson's conduct raised concerns among her colleagues, but she had apparently ignored their recommendations to address potential ethical violations. The pattern of misconduct was becoming impossible to deny or rationalize. Jackson stood up abruptly, her movement so sudden that it knocked over her water glass, sending liquid spreading across the table and dripping onto the floor. "I will not sit here and listen to these lies any longer," she declared, her voice breaking. "This entire proceeding is a sham designed to undermine the integrity of the Supreme Court itself." But even as she spoke, Jackson's words seemed to confirm rather than refute the allegations against her. Instead of addressing the substance of the evidence, she was attacking the forum and the messenger, classic tactics employed by those who have no adequate defense for their conduct. Bondi remained seated, her demeanor calm and professional, even as chaos erupted around her. "Justice Jackson, I understand that this information is difficult to hear, But ignoring evidence of ethical violations doesn't make them disappear. The American people deserve better from those who hold the highest judicial office in our nation. The cameras continued recording as Jackson gathered her papers with shaking hands, clearly preparing to leave the auditorium. Her departure would be captured by every media outlet in the room, creating images that would likely define her legacy for years to come. As Jackson moved toward the exit, several audience members began applauding Bondi's presentation. The applause started tentatively, with just a few individuals clapping slowly, but it gradually built into sustained recognition of what they had witnessed. It wasn't celebration of Jackson's downfall, but appreciation for Bondi's courage in presenting evidence that most people would have been afraid to reveal in such a public forum. Dr. Chen, the Harvard professor who had been documenting the evening's events, stood and began clapping with obvious approval. Her gesture was significant, as it represented the academic legal community's recognition that Bondi had presented credible evidence of serious misconduct rather than engaging in political theater. Jackson paused at the auditorium door, turning back to face the audience one final time. For a moment, it seemed as though she might attempt to deliver some kind of closing statement that could salvage her reputation. But as she looked out at the sea of faces, many of them showing disappointment and disapproval, she seemed to realize that no words could undo the damage that had been done. Without speaking, Jackson turned and walked through the exit, her entourage of clerks and security personnel scrambling to keep up with her hasty departure. The heavy wooden doors closed behind her with a finality that seemed to echo through the auditorium, marking the end of what had begun as a routine academic discussion and concluded as one of the most significant judicial scandals in recent American history. The audience remained seated for several moments after Jackson's departure, as if they were all processing what they had witnessed. The evening had begun with expectations of intellectual discourse between two legal minds, but it had evolved into something unprecedented: the real-time destruction of a Supreme Court justice's career through the methodical presentation of evidence that she could neither deny nor adequately explain. Bondi calmly organized her documents, placing them back into her briefcase with the same methodical precision she had shown throughout the evening. Her demeanor suggested neither triumph nor vindication, but rather the quiet satisfaction of someone who had fulfilled a difficult but necessary duty. Professor Henley approached the podium hesitantly, clearly uncertain about how to conclude an event that had veered so far from its intended format. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice uncertain, "I think we can all agree that this evening has taken an unexpected turn. The allegations we've heard tonight are serious and will undoubtedly be the subject of extensive investigation and discussion in the days and weeks to come." But even as he spoke, it was clear that the formal portion of the evening's program had become irrelevant. The real business had been conducted during the confrontation between Bondi and Jackson, and everything else was merely administrative detail. As audience members began filing out of the auditorium, many of them were already on their phones, sharing what they had witnessed with colleagues and contacts across the country. Within minutes, social media platforms would be flooded with eyewitness accounts of Jackson's public humiliation, and news organizations would be scrambling to verify and expand upon the allegations Bondi had presented. The C-SPAN cameras continued recording as the auditorium gradually emptied, capturing images that would be replayed countless times in the coming days. The sight of empty chairs and scattered papers seemed to symbolize the wreckage of Jackson's reputation, destroyed not through political maneuvering or partisan attack, but through the careful presentation of evidence that revealed systematic, ethical violations. In the media control room, producers were already editing footage of the evening's events, preparing segments that would lead every major news broadcast in the country. The story had everything that modern media craved. A powerful figure brought low, shocking revelations backed by documentary evidence and dramatic confrontation captured on live television. But beyond the immediate media spectacle, the evening's events had implications that would reshape American judicial politics for years to come. The Supreme Court, already struggling with questions about its legitimacy and impartiality, would now face a crisis of confidence that would be difficult to overcome. Public trust in the institution, essential for its continued authority, had been severely damaged by the revelation that at least one justice had systematically violated ethical standards for personal gain. Legal scholars would spend months analyzing the implications of what had been revealed, while congressional leaders would face pressure to initiate formal impeachment proceedings against Jackson. The process would be lengthy and politically charged, but the evidence Bondi had presented made some form of accountability virtually inevitable. As the auditorium lights dimmed and the last stragglers made their way to the exits, the magnitude of what had transpired was beginning to sink in. In the span of less than 2 hours, a routine academic symposium had become the venue for one of the most significant judicial scandals in American history. Orchestrated by a former state attorney general who had demonstrated that careful preparation and strategic timing could topple even the most powerful figures in the legal establishment. The evening had ended not with the intellectual fireworks that had been promised, but with the methodical destruction of a career built on arrogance. And sustained by institutional protection, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson had arrived at Georgetown Law School expecting to demonstrate her superiority over a former state official, but she was leaving as a disgraced figure whose judicial legacy would forever be defined by the ethical violations that Pam Bondi had so expertly exposed. The reverberations from this confrontation would continue long after the cameras stopped rolling and the audience dispersed. In law schools across the country, professors would use the evening's events as a case study in judicial ethics and the importance of institutional accountability. In newsrooms, investigative reporters would begin digging deeper into the Supreme Court's internal operations, seeking to uncover additional evidence of misconduct that might have been overlooked. Most importantly, the American people would begin asking harder questions about the individuals they had entrusted with interpreting their Constitution and protecting their rights. The revelation that a Supreme Court justice had used her position for personal financial gain would fundamentally alter public perception of the court, forcing a long overdue reckoning with the reality that judicial power, like all forms of authority, required constant vigilance to prevent its abuse. As Bondi gathered her materials and prepared to leave the auditorium, she could not have known that her methodical presentation of evidence would spark a national conversation about judicial accountability that would continue for years to come. But she had accomplished something that critics of the Supreme Court had been trying to achieve for decades. She had proven that even the most powerful figures in the American legal system could be held accountable for their conduct when the evidence against them was overwhelming and the person presenting it was prepared to accept the consequences of speaking truth to power. The heavy wooden doors of Georgetown Law Center closed behind Justice Jackson, with a sound that seemed to echo through the corridors of American jurisprudence itself. Within moments of her departure, the auditorium transformed from a venue of academic discourse into the epicenter of a media earthquake that would reshape the landscape of judicial accountability forever. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a constitutional law professor from Columbia University who had remained silent throughout the evening's dramatic revelations, was among the first to grasp the full magnitude of what had just transpired. As she stepped into the hallway outside the auditorium, her phone was already buzzing with urgent calls from colleagues across the country who had been monitoring the C-SPAN broadcast. The legal academic community typically insular and slow to react to external events, was mobilizing with unprecedented speed. Within 30 minutes of Jackson's humiliating exit, the first emergency faculty meeting was convened at Harvard Law School. Dean Michael Torres, who had been watching the Georgetown Symposium from his office in Cambridge, understood immediately that the evening's events would fundamentally alter how law schools approach the teaching of judicial ethics. The theoretical discussions that had dominated academic curricula for decades had suddenly become painfully relevant, transformed by Bondi's methodical presentation into a case study of real-world consequences for ethical failures. Meanwhile, in newsrooms across Washington, D.C., assignment editors were scrambling to deploy their most experienced investigative reporters to follow up on Bondi's revelations. The evidence she had presented was so detailed and well documented that it provided multiple avenues for further investigation, each potentially leading to additional scandals within the federal judiciary. Sarah Martinez, the Supreme Court correspondent for the Washington Post, had been monitoring the Georgetown event from her desk when Bondi began presenting her evidence. Within minutes, she was on the phone with her editor, requesting immediate authorization to begin a comprehensive investigation into Jackson's financial dealings. The newspaper's legal team was simultaneously reviewing the allegations to ensure that any reporting would meet the rigorous standards required for stories involving sitting Supreme Court justices. At the offices of the New York Times, veteran judicial reporter David Chen was already drafting what would become the lead story in the following morning's edition. His decades of experience covering the Supreme Court had taught him to recognize genuinely significant developments, and the evening's events clearly fell into that category. The combination of documented evidence, credible allegations, and Jackson's inability to provide adequate responses created a story that would dominate news cycles for weeks to come. But perhaps the most significant immediate reaction came from within the halls of Congress itself. Representative Jennifer Walsh, chairwoman of the House Judiciary Committee, had been alerted to the Georgetown events by her chief of staff, who had been monitoring C-SPAN coverage from his home in Virginia. Walsh understood immediately that the committee would need to initiate formal proceedings to investigate the allegations against Jackson, regardless of the political implications. The constitutional framework for addressing judicial misconduct was clear, but rarely invoked. Article 2 of the Constitution provided for the impeachment of federal judges for high crimes and misdemeanors, a standard that certainly encompassed the systematic ethical violations that Bondi had documented. However, the political reality of impeaching a sitting Supreme Court justice was extraordinarily complex, particularly given Jackson's status as the first African-American woman to serve on the court. Walsh's first call was to Representative Marcus Thompson, the ranking minority member of the Judiciary Committee and a former federal prosecutor who had extensive experience with judicial ethics cases. Despite their partisan differences on most issues, both lawmakers recognized that the allegations against Jackson transcended normal political considerations and required a careful, bipartisan response. Thompson, who had been watching the Georgetown Symposium from his congressional office, was already consulting with committee staff about the procedural requirements for initiating an impeachment inquiry. The evidence Bondi had presented appeared to meet the legal standards for constitutional violations, but the political process would require careful navigation to ensure that justice was pursued without appearing to target Jackson because of her race or gender. As news of the evening's events spread through Washington's political establishment, reaction fell along predictable partisan lines, but with significant exceptions that highlighted the severity of the allegations. Several prominent Democratic Senators, who would normally be expected to defend a Democratic appointee to the Supreme Court, issued carefully worded statements calling for thorough investigation of all allegations and full transparency in judicial conduct. Senator Patricia Williams of California, herself a former federal judge, released a statement within hours of Jackson's departure from Georgetown that surprised many political observers with its directness. The allegations presented tonight, if substantiated, represent violations of judicial ethics so serious that they cannot be ignored or dismissed. The integrity of our judicial system depends on public confidence that justices are acting in accordance with the highest ethical standards, and that confidence has been seriously undermined by what we witnessed this evening. The reaction from conservative lawmakers was more predictably harsh, but even some Republican senators who might have been expected to use the scandal for maximum political advantage recognized that the situation required careful handling. Senator Robert Hayes of Texas, a frequent critic of the Supreme Court's liberal justices, issued a statement calling for deliberate and thorough investigation rather than rushing to judgment, understanding that the credibility of any eventual accountability measures would depend on following proper constitutional procedures. Meanwhile, at the Supreme Court building itself, the remaining 8 justices were grappling with an unprecedented crisis that threatened to undermine the institution's authority and credibility. Chief Justice Roberts, who had been informed of the Georgetown events by his clerk shortly after Jackson's departure, convened an emergency meeting of the court's administrative staff to begin damage control efforts. The Chief Justice faced a particularly delicate situation. The internal memorandum that Bondi had referenced during her presentation was authentic, and Roberts knew that his recommendation for Jackson to consult with the court's ethics advisor had been documented in official court records. The revelation of internal court discussions about Jackson's conduct would inevitably lead to questions about what other justices knew and when they knew it. Justice Samuel Alito, who had been among the justices expressing private concerns about Jackson's potential conflicts of interest, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his institutional loyalty tested against his commitment to judicial integrity. The conservative justices had long argued that the court's credibility depended on strict adherence to ethical standards, and Jackson's apparent violations of those standards created a dilemma that transcended ideological considerations. The court's Public Information Office, typically one of the most controlled and measured institutions in Washington, was struggling to formulate an appropriate response to the mounting media inquiries. The standard approach of declining comment on matters involving individual justices was clearly inadequate, given the severity and specificity of the allegations, but any substantive response risked further damaging the court's reputation. As the immediate shock of the evening's events began to give way to more considered analysis, legal experts across the country were assessing the broader implications of what had been revealed. Professor Elizabeth Carter of Stanford Law School, widely regarded as the nation's leading authority on judicial ethics, was contacted by multiple news organizations seeking expert commentary on the significance of Bondi's allegations. Carter's initial reaction was both professional and personal. As someone who had spent her career studying and teaching about judicial conduct, she understood that the systematic nature of Jackson's apparent violations represented something unprecedented in modern Supreme Court history. While individual justices had faced ethics questions in the past, the evidence Bondi had presented suggested a pattern of deliberate misconduct that went to the heart of judicial integrity. In her first interview following the Georgetown events, Carter told CNN that what we witnessed tonight represents either the most sophisticated frame-up in political history or evidence of judicial misconduct so serious that it threatens the fundamental legitimacy of the Supreme Court. Given the specificity and documentation of the allegations and Justice Jackson's inability to provide adequate responses, I believe we must take these charges with the utmost seriousness. The financial markets also reacted swiftly to the evening's revelations. Within hours of the Georgetown Symposium's conclusion, futures markets were pricing in increased volatility for pharmaceutical and financial services stocks, sectors that had been specifically mentioned in Bondi's presentation as beneficiaries of Jackson's alleged insider trading. The possibility that Supreme Court decisions had been influenced by personal financial considerations created uncertainty about the stability of legal precedents in those industries. Investment advisors who specialized in regulatory arbitrage strategies found themselves fielding urgent calls from clients seeking to understand the implications of Jackson's alleged misconduct for their portfolios. If Supreme Court decisions could no longer be assumed to be based solely on legal merit, the entire framework for predicting regulatory outcomes would need to be reconsidered. The legal profession itself was experiencing what could only be described as an existential crisis. Bar associations across the country were convening emergency meetings to discuss appropriate responses to allegations that struck at the heart of professional ethics. The American Bar Association's Ethics Committee announced within 24 hours that it would be conducting its own review of the allegations, despite having no formal jurisdiction over Supreme Court justices. At law firms specializing in Supreme Court practice, partners were urgently reviewing their recent cases for any potential connection to Jackson's alleged conflicts of interest. The possibility that court decisions had been tainted by personal financial considerations raised questions about the validity of legal precedents and the reliability of strategic advice that had been provided to clients based on predicted court outcomes. The international legal community was also paying close attention to the unfolding scandal. The Supreme Court's reputation for integrity and impartiality had long been seen as a model for judicial systems around the world, and the allegations against Jackson were being viewed as a test of American democracy's ability to hold its most powerful institutions accountable. Foreign legal scholars and practitioners who had studied the American system were expressing both shock and cautious optimism about the developments. Dr. Hans Mueller, a constitutional law professor at the University of Berlin, who had written extensively about comparative judicial systems, observed that while the allegations against Justice Jackson are deeply troubling, the swift and transparent response from American institutions demonstrates the strength of democratic accountability mechanisms. However, authoritarian governments around the world were already using the scandal to undermine American moral authority in international forums. Chinese state media, in particular, was highlighting the Jackson allegations as evidence of systemic corruption in American institutions, using the scandal to deflect criticism of their own judicial system's lack of independence. Back in the United States, grassroots organizations focused on government accountability were mobilizing to ensure that the allegations against Jackson received appropriate investigation and consequences. Common Cause, the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, and similar organizations were coordinating their efforts to maintain public pressure for comprehensive investigation and appropriate accountability measures. These organizations understood that the Jackson scandal represented both an opportunity and a test for the broader movement toward greater governmental transparency and accountability. If a sitting Supreme Court justice could systematically violate ethical standards without consequences, it would set a precedent that would make it virtually impossible to hold other government officials accountable for similar misconduct. The religious community was also grappling with the implications of the scandal. Many faith leaders who had supported Jackson's confirmation because of her personal story and professional qualifications were struggling to reconcile their admiration for her achievements with the evidence of ethical violations that Bondi had presented. Reverend Michael Johnson, a prominent Baptist minister who had praised Jackson's confirmation as a historic breakthrough for African American representation on the court, issued a carefully worded statement calling for truth and accountability, regardless of personal feelings or political considerations. His statement reflected the broader tension within communities that had celebrated Jackson's appointment but could not ignore evidence of serious misconduct. Meanwhile, Pam Bondi herself was experiencing the complex aftermath of her methodical destruction of Jackson's reputation. The former Florida Attorney General had returned to her hotel room in Washington, D.C., following the Georgetown symposium. But she found little rest, as her phone rang constantly with requests for interviews and follow-up information from reporters, congressional staff, and legal organizations. Bondi's approach to the post-symposium media attention was characteristically measured and strategic. She understood that her credibility depended on maintaining the same professional demeanor that had made her presentation so devastating. Rather than capitalizing on the moment for personal or political gain, she focused on ensuring that the evidence she had presented would receive appropriate investigation and follow-up. In her first post-symposium interview, conducted by phone with the Wall Street Journal, Bondi emphasized that her motivation had been institutional rather than personal. "I have no animosity toward Justice Jackson as an individual," she explained. "But when I became aware of evidence suggesting systematic violations of judicial ethics, I felt a professional and civic obligation to bring that evidence to public attention. The integrity of our judicial system is too important to be compromised by personal considerations or political calculations." Bondi's measured response to her sudden return to national prominence stood in stark contrast to Jackson's panicked departure from the Georgetown auditorium. While Jackson had responded to evidence of misconduct with defensive deflection and personal attacks, Bondi was demonstrating the kind of institutional respect and professional integrity that the public expected from those who had held high office. The former Attorney General's handling of the post-symposium period also reflected her understanding of the broader implications of what had transpired. She recognized that the Jackson scandal was not just about one individual's ethical failures, but about the need for systematic reforms to prevent similar violations in the future. In subsequent interviews, Bondi consistently emphasized the need for stronger oversight mechanisms for federal judges, more stringent financial disclosure requirements, and clearer standards for recusal in cases involving potential conflicts of interest. Her focus on institutional reform, rather than personal vindication, further enhanced her credibility and made it more difficult for Jackson's defenders to dismiss the allegations as politically motivated attacks. The House Judiciary Committee moved with unusual speed to begin formal proceedings in response to the Georgetown revelations. Within 48 hours of the symposium, Chairwoman Walsh announced that the committee would hold emergency hearings to examine the allegations against Jackson and consider whether they warranted impeachment proceedings. The announcement of congressional hearings transformed the Jackson scandal from a media story into a constitutional crisis with potentially historic implications. Only one Supreme Court justice had ever been impeached in American history, and that case had involved allegations far less serious than those Bondi had presented against Jackson. The political dynamics surrounding the potential impeachment were extraordinarily complex. Democrats faced the dilemma of either defending a justice whose conduct appeared indefensible or participating in proceedings that could result in the removal of the first African-American woman ever to serve on the Supreme Court. Republicans, while eager to pursue accountability for Jackson's apparent violations, also recognized that any impeachment process would need to be conducted with scrupulous fairness to maintain credibility. The committee's first challenge was determining the scope of its investigation. Bondi's presentation had focused on specific allegations of financial misconduct and conflicts of interest. But committee staff were already uncovering additional evidence suggesting that Jackson's ethical violations might be more extensive than originally revealed. Banking records subpoenaed by the committee revealed a pattern of financial transactions that appeared to be coordinated with Jackson's judicial calendar in ways that suggested advanced knowledge of court decisions. Phone records showed frequent communications between Jackson and investment advisors during periods when the court was deliberating on cases that would affect the value of her holdings. Perhaps most damaging email records obtained from the Supreme Court servers revealed internal discussions in which Jackson had explicitly discussed the timing of certain decisions in terms of their impact on her personal financial interests. These communications provided direct evidence of the kind of coordination between judicial duties and personal finances that Bondi had alleged during her Georgetown presentation. The accumulating evidence created a situation where Jackson's continued service on the Supreme Court became increasingly untenable. Legal experts across the political spectrum were reaching the conclusion that the allegations against her were not only credible, but represented violations of judicial ethics so serious that they could not be overlooked or minimized. Even Jackson's most loyal supporters were beginning to recognize that her position had become unsustainable. Former colleagues from her time as a federal appeals court judge privately expressed shock at the evidence that was emerging, describing behavior that was completely at odds with the professional conduct they had observed during her earlier judicial service. The pressure for Jackson's resignation was building from multiple directions simultaneously. Editorial boards at major newspapers that had supported her confirmation were calling for her to step down pending resolution of the ethics investigation. Bar associations were considering formal disciplinary proceedings that could result in professional sanctions even if she remained on the court. Most significantly, several of Jackson's colleagues on the Supreme Court were privately encouraging her to consider resignation as the least damaging option for both herself and the institution. Chief Justice Roberts, in particular, was reportedly urging Jackson to consider the broader implications of her continued service for the court's credibility and effectiveness. The constitutional framework for addressing Jackson's situation provided several potential outcomes, none of them favorable to her continued service. Impeachment and removal by Congress was the most dramatic possibility, but resignation under pressure was becoming increasingly likely as the evidence of misconduct continued to accumulate. Jackson's legal team was exploring potential defenses, but the documentary evidence Bondi had assembled was so comprehensive and well documented that traditional litigation strategies were largely ineffective. The banking records, email communications, and phone logs created a paper trail that was difficult to explain away through legal technicalities or procedural challenges. The former justice's financial advisors were also facing potential legal consequences as the investigation expanded. The investment strategies that had generated substantial profits for Jackson's family trust appeared to violate securities laws prohibiting trading on material, non-public information, exposing the advisors to potential criminal prosecution for their role in the scheme. Federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York announced that they were opening a criminal investigation into Jackson's financial dealings, focusing specifically on potential violations of insider trading laws and obstruction of justice. The involvement of federal prosecutors raised the stakes considerably, as criminal charges would make it virtually impossible for Jackson to remain on the court even if she survived impeachment proceedings. The criminal investigation also created additional pressure for Jackson to cooperate with congressional inquiries. Prosecutors indicated that they would be examining whether Jackson had made false statements to Congress during her confirmation hearings regarding her financial interests and ethical obligations, potentially exposing her to perjury charges in addition to the underlying ethics violations. As the various investigations proceeded, public opinion was solidifying around the conclusion that Jackson's conduct had been unacceptable for a Supreme Court justice. Polling conducted in the weeks following the Georgetown symposium showed overwhelming bipartisan support for accountability measures, with clear majorities supporting resignation or removal regardless of party affiliation. The depth of public disappointment was particularly striking given the historic nature of Jackson's appointment. Many Americans who had celebrated her confirmation as a breakthrough for representation and diversity were expressing profound disillusionment with her apparent betrayal of the trust that had been placed in her. Community leaders who had praised Jackson as a role model were struggling to explain her conduct to young people who had looked up to her as an example of achievement and integrity. The scandal was having ripple effects that extended far beyond the legal profession, undermining confidence in institutions and leadership across American society. Religious and civic organizations that had celebrated Jackson's appointment were organizing forums to discuss the broader implications of the scandal for questions of ethics, accountability, and public service. These discussions reflected a growing recognition that the Jackson case represented more than just an individual failure, but a systemic challenge to the integrity of American institutions. Educational institutions were also grappling with the implications of the scandal. Law schools that had highlighted Jackson's career as an example of professional excellence were revising curricula to address the ethical issues raised by her conduct. The case was becoming a teaching tool for discussions about professional responsibility and the importance of maintaining public trust. The financial markets continued to experience volatility as investors struggled to assess the implications of the scandal for regulatory predictability. The possibility that Supreme Court decisions had been influenced by personal financial considerations created uncertainty about the stability of legal precedents across multiple industries. Investment advisors specializing in regulatory arbitrage strategies found their business models under scrutiny as clients questioned whether similar schemes might be operating in other parts of the government. The Jackson scandal was highlighting vulnerabilities in the financial oversight system that had previously been overlooked or ignored. International observers were closely monitoring the American response to the Jackson scandal as a test of democratic accountability mechanisms. The swift and transparent investigation of the allegations was being viewed as evidence of institutional strength, but the underlying misconduct was raising questions about the effectiveness of oversight systems for high-level officials. Foreign governments that had looked to the American judicial system as a model were reconsidering their assessments and exploring alternative approaches to judicial governance. The scandal was having implications that extended far beyond American borders, affecting international perceptions of democratic institutions and the rule of law. As the various investigations continued and pressure for accountability mounted, Jackson's position became increasingly untenable. The combination of documented evidence, bipartisan political pressure, criminal investigation, and public disapproval created a situation where resignation appeared to be the only viable option for avoiding even more severe consequences. The announcement, when it finally came, was delivered through a brief written statement released by Jackson's attorney rather than through a personal appearance or press conference. The statement acknowledged errors in judgment and expressed regret for any appearance of impropriety, but stopped short of admitting to the specific violations that Bondi had documented. Jackson's resignation letter to President Biden was similarly circumspect, focusing on her desire to avoid further distraction from the important work of the Supreme Court, rather than accepting responsibility for the ethical violations that had made her continued service impossible. The resignation marked the end of a judicial career that had begun with historic promise but concluded in unprecedented disgrace. Jackson's fall from the pinnacle of American jurisprudence to resigned justice represented one of the most dramatic reversals of fortune in modern political history, accomplished through the methodical presentation of evidence by a former state official who had refused to allow institutional protection to shield misconduct from accountability. The broader implications of the Jackson scandal continued to reverberate through American institutions long after her resignation. Congressional leaders committed to strengthening oversight mechanisms for federal judges, implementing more stringent financial disclosure requirements, and establishing clearer standards for recusal in cases involving potential conflicts of interest. Legal education was also transformed by the scandal, with law schools across the country implementing enhanced curricula focused on professional responsibility and judicial ethics. The Jackson case became a central component of these programs, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of maintaining public trust through consistent adherence to the highest ethical standards. Most importantly, the scandal demonstrated that even the most powerful figures in American government could be held accountable for their conduct when evidence of misconduct was thoroughly documented and courageously presented. Pam Bondi's methodical destruction of Jackson's career had proven that institutional protection and political consideration could not shield those who betrayed the public trust from the consequences of their actions. The 30 seconds that had ended Jackson's career had begun a process of institutional renewal that would strengthen American democracy for generations to come. The lesson was clear. In a system based on the rule of law, no one was above accountability, and the truth, when courageously presented, retained the power to bring even the mighty to justice. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.